The foreman stormed over, his face red. "Lost Grandma," he yelled, grabbing my elbow to steer me off the construction site. He was so loud, so sure I was just a confused old woman. He never bothered to check the name on the blueprints he was about to use to kick me off my own project. The taxi let me off a block away. The driver wouldn't go any closer, not with the street half closed and the air thick with the roar of heavy machinery. I paid the fare and stepped out, the noise hitting me like a physical wave. It was a sound I loved, the sound of progress, of something massive being born. I walked toward the gate, the sidewalk vibrating beneath my sensible shoes. The air smelled of diesel, damp earth, and the sharp, hot temps of welding. Above me, the steel skeleton of my building clawed at the morning sky. The Vance Tower. My design dotted the gate. A young security guard sat in a small hut, staring at his phone. "Here to see the site?" I said. He looked up, his eyes glancing over my simple linen dress and then landing on my face. His expression went from bored to annoyed. "This is an active construction site, ma'am. Not a tourist stop. I'm here for an inspection." He sighed. A long put-upon sound. "Fine." He shoved a clipboard and a hardhat through the window. "Sign in. Hat stays on at all times. Stay on the marked walkways." He called me ma'am in that specific way that means old, frail, and in the way. I signed my name Evelyn Reed on the log. He didn't even look at it. He just took the clipboard back and nodded toward the gate, his attention already back on his phone. I pulled the white hardhat on. The plastic suspension inside was cold against my hair. I stepped past the chain-link fence, and the ground immediately changed from smooth pavement to a rugged landscape of packed mud, gravel, and discarded lumber. I bypassed the marked visitor walkway and headed for the ramps that led down into the earth. The real work, the heart of the building, was happening 3 levels below ground. The noise grew louder. A constant beep, beep, beep of a reversing truck, the high-pitched scream of a rebar cutter, and the deep, rhythmic thud of a pile driver somewhere in the distance. I found what I was looking for on sublevel 3. I stood at the edge of a massive, new-poured concrete deck, where a crew was laying out the rebar grid for the next section. I frowned. Something was wrong. My eyes traced the steel bars. The specs called for number 8 bars, spaced at 6-inch centers. This was number 6, and the spacing was closer to a foot apart. I looked at the forms they were building for the next pour. They looked shallow. My stomach tightened. This deck was the anchor. It had to support the transfer beams for the entire lower structure. A mistake here, and the integrity of the first 10 floors would be compromised. I was standing there, calculating the load differential, when a voice boomed across the concrete expanse. "Hey, you!" I turned. A man in a bright tealo vest was storming toward me. He was stocky, with a sunburnt face and a clipboard clutched in one hand. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" He got right in my face. I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "Lost Grandma. This is a dangerous area. This isn't a nursing home tour, sweetheart. Get off my site." I just looked at him, my expression calm. "This isn't a park. You can't just wander in here." He waved his arm, encompassing the whole site. "You're a liability. You know that. I swear, the public, ... You trip, you fall, it's my neck." A few of the workers on the rebar crew had stopped. They were watching us. One of them, a young man, covered his mouth, but his shoulders were shaking. He was laughing. The foreman's face got redder. He seemed to enjoy the audience. "I'm not lost," I said, my voice even. "Yeah, that's what they all say." He jabbed a thick finger toward the exit ramp. "Out now. Before you fall in something." I didn't move. I glanced back at the flawed rebar grid. "That deck, ... The deck is none of your business, lady." He was vibrating with self-importance. "It's for people who know what they're doing, not for, well, Not for you. He puffed out his chest. You need to see the boundaries. Is that it? You don't understand authorized personnel only. He huffed, a sound like a bull. Fine. He turned on his heel and stomped toward a large white pickup truck parked near the ramp. He yanked the driver's side door open, leaned in, and came out with a thick, rolled-up tube of paper. He slammed the door and marched back, smacking the tube against his palm. You want to see the rules? I'll show you the rules. He was coming to show me my own name. I stood perfectly still, and I waited. He stomped back over, the heavy roll of paper in his fist. He was still talking, mostly to himself now. Some people just don't listen, think the rules don't apply. He didn't stop in front of me. He marched right past me to his white pickup truck, its tires caked in mud. He threw the roll onto the hood. The sound was a dull thump. With angry, jerky movements, he snapped the red elastic bands off the roll and spread the blueprint open. The sheet was huge, easily 3 feet by 4. It covered his entire windshield. The paper crackled, fighting him as he tried to flatten it. See? He yelled, his voice echoing off the concrete walls of the foundation. He stabbed his finger right at the bottom right corner, at the title block. Right here. It says authorized personnel. Oh, his voice stopped. It didn't trail off. It just cut out. Like someone had hit a mute button. His body was frozen. His arm was outstretched, his thick finger still pressed firmly to the paper. The only thing that moved was his head, just a fraction, as his eyes scanned the text under his own finger. The whole sight seemed to change. The beep, beep, beep of the reversing truck was suddenly distant. The chatter of the rebar crew was gone. I could feel their eyes on us. The young man who had been laughing was now standing straight, his hammer loose in his hand. I walked slowly toward the truck. The smell of the diesel exhaust from a nearby generator was strong. I stopped beside him, my hip level with the truck's grill. I looked down at the blueprint. It was the master plan for the foundation. My drawing. My design. His finger was resting right next to the box that contained my name. The text was large, black, and unmistakable. Project. The Vance Tower Chief Architect and Lead Designer, Dr. Evelyn Reed firm. Reed and Associates. His finger was trembling. Just slightly. He slowly, very slowly, pulled his hand back. He looked at me. His face, which had been red with anger, was now a pale, waxy color. His eyes were wide, and I could see the panic rising in them. He looked from my face to the name and back to my face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I didn't smile. I didn't scold. I just looked at him. My name, I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the air. I reached out and tapped the paper he had just been pointing at. My building. I let my hand rest on the crisp sheet for a moment. Then I looked back at him. And you are, he swallowed. I could see his Adam's apple bob in his throat. Mark, he finally managed to say. His voice was a hoarse whisper. Mark Jensen. I'm the site foreman. He kept looking at me as if I might suddenly change shape. Dr. Reed, I had no idea. I'm so sorry. You. I mean, I didn't see your credentials. That is painfully obvious, I said, cutting him off. The ice in my own voice surprised me. I turned away from him, leaving him standing by his truck, and walked the few steps back to the edge of the new concrete deck. I pointed down at the rebar grid. What's less obvious, Mr. Jensen, is why your team is using a 6-inch pour on this sublevel 3 deck when my specs clearly call for an 8-inch reinforced slab? He fumbled, pulling a wadded-up tissue from his pocket to wipe his forehead. What? No, the specs. We're following the specs. Your crew, I said, my voice rising just enough to carry, is laying number 6 rebar at 12-inch centers. My specs call for number 8 at 6-inch centers. I looked him straight in the eye. I wasn't lost, Mr. Jensen. I was inspecting your team's critical error. an error that would have compromised the structural integrity of the first 10 floors. I pointed up toward the open sky where those 10 floors would one day be. An error you clearly missed while you were busy yelling. His face went from pale to sick. He looked desperately at the rebar, as if seeing it for the first time. He ripped a folded, dirty set of plans from his back pocket. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely unfold the paper. He flipped through the pages, his breathing fast and shallow. He found the page. He read it. He read it again. He looked up at me, and the arrogance was completely gone. All that was left was the raw, cold fear of a man who knew he was caught. He had failed, and he knew it. And I knew it. He didn't say a word. He couldn't. I let the silence hang in the air, heavy as the concrete itself. Just as the silence stretched, a new sound joined the mix. Footsteps. Fast ones. Not the heavy, confident tread of the workers, but a quicker, more anxious sound on the gravel ramp behind me. I heard a voice call out, breathless. "Mark, we just got a call. Is Dr. Reed, ... I turned. A man in a pressed shirt and a spotless white hardhat was rushing toward us. This was David, the project manager. I'd spoken to him on video calls, but never in person. He was flanked by 2 others, a man and a woman, wearing suits that looked completely wrong for a construction site. Their shoes were already covered in dust. They looked like they had run from the site office. They all stopped dead about 10 feet away. They were just in time. They saw the scene exactly as it was. The foreman, Mark, standing frozen by his truck, pale and shaking. The entire rebar crew, silent, watching. And me, standing calmly, my hand gesturing toward the flawed steel grid. David's eyes darted from me to Mark and back to me. His professional smile was fixed, but his eyes were wide with panic. "Dr. Reed," he said, rushing forward, his hand outstretched. We had no idea you were scheduled for a visit today. Is everything all right? We would have had someone meet you at the gate." He grabbed my hand and shook it a little too hard. "It's an honor to finally meet you in person." "It's not a social visit, David," I said. David's smile faltered. He looked at Mark, his voice sharpening. "Mark, what's going on here? Why does Dr. Reed look concerned?" Mark Jensen looked like a cornered animal. He couldn't look at me, and he could barely look at his own boss. She, he stammered. Dr. Reed was just pointing out a potential discrepancy in the ... In the deck, a discrepancy? I repeated. The 2 executives in suits were now standing right behind David. The woman had taken out a thin tablet and was tapping on it. The man was just staring at the rebar, then at me, as if trying to understand the situation. I looked straight at David. "It's not a discrepancy, Mr. Jensen. It's a fundamental error." I pointed down. "Your crew is installing number 6 rebar at 12-inch centers. My specs, which I personally signed off on, call for number 8 rebar at 6-inch centers. This deck is being poured 2 inches to shallow." David's face went white. "What?" He stumbled over to the edge of the deck and stared down. He snatched the dirty folded plans from Mark's hand. "Mark, just let them go." "My God," David whispered. He looked at the paper, then at the steel. "My God, she's right." He spun on Mark, his voice suddenly loud and sharp. "You signed off on this pour. I asked you this morning if we were on spec. I asked you." I thought it was the right gauge," Mark said, his voice weak. "The shipment, it looked right. I told them to lay it out." He just wilted, his excuses dying in his throat. He knew it. There was no excuse. I held up one hand. The argument stopped. They all looked at me. In that moment, I was the only person on that site who was not panicking. I looked past Mark, my eyes fixed on David. "Your foreman has demonstrated 2 things this morning," I said, my voice clear and steady. "First, that he cannot read a blueprint, and second, that he cannot identify a critical safety flaw that he is standing right on top of. I paused, letting the words hang in the heavy, diesel-scented air. He was, however, I continued, very focused on removing me from the site for being lost. He was loud, unprofessional, and he put his own ego above the safety of this structure. David looked like he was going to be sick. The woman with the tablet had stopped typing. "He is a liability," I said. It wasn't an opinion. It was a fact. I walked over to the truck, where the big blueprint was still spread across the hood. Mark flinched as I got close, but I didn't even look at him. I neatly folded the large sheet. It was a practiced, precise set of motions. The paper was stiff, but it obeyed. I walked back to David and held the folded blueprint out to him. He took it with a shaking hand. "Get him off my site," I said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. I watched David nod, just once. He didn't argue. He knew he couldn't. I turned away from all of them then, from the executives, from the project manager, and from the foreman who had just lost his job. I looked back at the flawed rebar. The problem was still there, waiting to be solved. My building was waiting. David didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone, his thumb moving quickly over the screen. "Security," he said into it, his voice low but firm. "Sublevel 3, I need an escort for Mark Jensen. He's being removed from the site. Effective immediately." We all stood in that strange, strained silence. The rebar crew, who had been frozen, started to murmur among themselves. They were casting sideways glances at Mark, then at me. Mark just stood there, his dirty plans still clutched in one hand. He looked small. The arrogance had evaporated, leaving nothing behind but a hollow shell. Two men in black uniforms appeared at the top of the ramp a few minutes later. They walked down with purpose. David just pointed at Mark. There was no argument. Mark dropped the plans, the paper fluttering to the muddy ground. He turned and walked between the two security guards, his shoulders slumped. He didn't look back. I watched him go. I felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just a cold, hard sense of necessity. The problem wasn't Mark. The problem was the concrete deck. When he was gone, I turned back to the crew. They were all watching me, their expressions a mix of fear and respect. I recognized the young man who had snickered earlier. He was pale, and he looked at the ground when my eyes passed over him. "Who's the lead on this crew?" I asked. A man, older than the rest, stepped forward. He pulled off his hardhat, revealing gray hair damp with sweat. "I am, ma'am, Leo." I nodded. "You all know this grid is wrong. You're experienced men. You knew the gauge was off and the spacing was wide. Why did you lay it?" Leo looked down at his boots. "Mark, Mr. Jensen. He told us to. He said the spec sheet had a revision, that he'd approved it. Said he was value engineering it. To save time." I closed my eyes for just a second. Value engineering. He was cutting corners. My corners. On my building. He lied, I said simply. This specification was never revised. It is critical. You all know what this deck supports. Leo nodded. "We do now, ma'am. All right." I turned to David, who was nervously tapping on his tablet. "David, this entire section has to be ripped out. All of it. The forms you built are 2 inches too shallow. The rebar is useless. It all has to go." David winced, clearly calculating the cost. "All of it." "Dr. Reed, that's a week's delay, at least." "A structural failure in 5 years would be a permanent delay," I said. "It comes out today." I turned back to Leo. "Leo, I want demo starting in 1 hour. I need jackhammers and cutters. I want every single piece of this number 6 rebar out of here and off my site. I want the forms completely rebuilt to the correct 8-inch depth. Understood?" The fear in Leo's face was replaced by something else. Understanding? Purpose? He put his hardhat back on. "Yes, ma'am. We'll get on it right now. Where's the rebar you pulled for this?" I asked. Stacked over by the north wall, he said. Quarantine it? I want it sent back. I'll need to know who your supplier is. David, I said, turning to the project manager. The executives behind him were just silent witnesses. Call the rebar supplier. Find out who authorized the shipment of number 6 instead of number 8. I want to know if the error started with them or with Mr. Jensen. Either way, they are replacing this entire order at their own cost. Tell them Dr. Evelyn Reed's firm will be auditing their contract. David just nodded, already dialing. Yes, Dr. Reed. And get me a coffee, I said, almost as an afterthought. Black, no sugar. He looked surprised for a split second, then nodded again. Right away. He dispatched one of the suits, who scurried off like a nervous intern. I turned back to the crew. Leo was already yelling orders. The men, who had been lazy and sloppy just 20 minutes before, were now moving with a speed and precision I hadn't seen. The young man who laughed was the first to grab a pry bar, his face set in concentration. The sound of pneumatic drills started up, a loud, jarring rattle that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. They were already starting the demolition. I walked over to a stack of plywood, found a clean spot, and sat down. I wasn't leaving. I would sit here and watch them tear out the mistake. The noise was terrible, but it was the sound of a problem being fixed. It was the sound of the job being done right. I thought about how icily this could have been missed. Buried under tons of concrete? A silent flaw, a ticking clock, waiting to fail. All because one man looked at me and saw an old woman, not an architect. The young executive in the soup bin, I'd heard David call him, returned about 15 minutes later. He was carefully carrying a single, steaming styrofoam cup. He looked even more out of place now, his polished shoes coated in a layer of fine gray concrete dust. Dr. Reed, he said, holding the cup out. Your coffee. Black. No sugar. Thank you, Ben, I said. He looked startled that I knew his name. Of course, Is there anything else? We can set up a chair from the office, or get you some water. This is fine, I said, taking the hot cup. I'm just watching the work. He hovered for a second, clearly unsure what his role was meant to be. I was the architect, but I was also the one who had just gotten his site foreman fired. I had become the highest authority on site by simply being right. You can go, I said, not unkindly. I'll let you know if I need anything. He nodded quickly and retreated, joining the other suit who was standing near David, both of them speaking into their phones. I sipped the coffee. It was strong and bitter, and it warmed my hands. The noise was immense. The pop-pop-pop of the jackhammers was a physical force, vibrating up from my feet. The crew was working with a desperate energy. Leo was in the middle of it, pointing, shouting, directing the demolition of his own flawed work. I watched them for an hour. Watched them shatter the shallow concrete forms and use heavy-duty cutters to slice through the thin rebar grid. The young man who had laughed at me was sweating heavily, his face grim with effort as he tossed bent steel rods onto a growing pile. David approached me again, holding his phone out as if it were a peace offering. Dr. Reed, he said, shouting over the noise. I have the supplier. He says the purchase order for the number 6 rebar came from Mark's email. He's sending the documentation over right now. He claims he was just filling the order he was given. I'm sure he does, I said. Tell him the replacement order for number 8 rebar is to be delivered by 6 a.m. tomorrow. Not a minute later, tell him my firm will be auditing his contract for this project, and if he wants to be paid, that rebar had better be on the truck. Yes, Dr. Reed, David said, and hurried away to pass on the message. The pile of rejected steel grew in the corner. It was a monument to Mark's stupidity. It was thousands of dollars of wasted material and a week of lost time, all because he tried to value engineer a design he didn't understand. All because he thought the architect was just some lost old woman. I thought about the foundation. This was the part of the building no one would ever see. No one would ever walk down here and admire the thickness of the slab or the gauge of the rebar. They would just trust it. They would work in the offices above, eat in the restaurants, live their lives, and trust that the building would hold them. Mark didn't see that. He saw a schedule. He saw a budget line. He didn't see the people. The sun moved across the rectangle of sky visible from the foundation pit. The shadows grew long. The noise never stopped. The executive, Ben, brought me a sandwich at lunchtime. I ate it without tasting it, my eyes on the crew. By late afternoon, the demolition was done. The last of the broken concrete and bent steel was being hauled away. Leo's team, covered in grime and sweat, immediately started building the new forms. I stood up from the plywood stack and walked over. The air was thick with dust, but I could smell the fresh-cut wood of the new forms. Leo was on his knees, a tape measure stretched across the new frame. He looked up as I approached. "We're setting them at 8 inches, ma'am," he said, tapping the tape. 8 inches on the dot, all the way across. I looked at the work. It was clean, precise, and strong. "Good, Leo. See that it stays that way. Your crew does good work when they're allowed to." He met my gaze. The fear was gone. He just looked tired and maybe a little proud. "We will, Dr. Reed." I gave him a single nod. The mistake was gone. The foundation was finally ready to be built correctly. As the afternoon light began to fade, the crew started setting up massive floodlights. The high-pitched whine of the generators filled the air. There was no question of stopping. They would work through the night to make up the lost time. I brushed the concrete dust from my dress. My work here was done. The mistake had been caught, the demolition was complete, and the correction was underway. I saw David, Ben, and the other executives standing in a tight cluster near the exit ramp. They were talking in low, serious tones, their tablets and phones in hand. When they saw me stand up, they stopped talking and walked over as a group. "Dr. Reed," David said. His voice was tired, but the frantic panic was gone. He was all business now. "First, on behalf of the entire project team, I want to offer our deepest apologies. What happened today, ... The disrespect you were shown. It is unacceptable." It was, I agreed. "But Mr. Jensen is gone. Apologies won't fix this deck." "No, ma'am," David said, nodding. "The rebar delivery is confirmed for 6 a.m. I've personally spoken to the supplier. They are sending their regional manager to oversee the delivery himself, at no cost to us, as you instructed." "Good," I said. "And the new pour. Leo's team will have the forms and primary grid laid by mid-morning, assuming the delivery is on time. We'll be ready to pour 24 hours after that, pending your final inspection." "My final inspection," I repeated. "David, I'm not coming here tomorrow. I'll be sending someone from my office, a junior architect. He will have a copy of the specs. He will have a tape measure, and he will have my authority. Do you understand?" "Yes, Dr. Reed, absolutely." Ben, the young executive, was taking notes on his tablet as I spoke. "This wasn't just a mistake," I said, my voice quiet but hard. It was arrogance. It was a man who thought he was smarter than the plans. He cut a corner that should never have been cut. He put this entire project and everyone who will one day work in it at risk. I looked at the three of them. "The plans are not suggestions. They are instructions. You will follow them to the letter. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, Dr. Reed," David said. The woman beside him nodded, her face grim. I turned to leave. As I walked past the work area, Leo saw me. He raised his hand, a simple gesture of respect. I nodded back. The young worker who had laughed at me was carrying a heavy sheet of plywood. He stopped as I passed. He didn't say anything, but he met my eyes. He just looked ashamed. I gave him a short nod. He had worked hard all day to fix the mistake. He had learned his lesson. I walked up the gravel ramp, my shoes crunching. The sounds of the site, the saws, The generators, the distant shout of a worker were behind me now. When I reached the top, I stopped for a moment and looked back. Down in the brightly lit pit, my pit, the crew was moving like a well-oiled machine. David, Ben, and the executive were already in a huddle with Leo. Pointing at the new forms, the plans unrolled on the hood of a different truck. They hadn't just been given orders. They had been reminded of what the job was. It was never about me. It wasn't about my name or my age or my gender. It was about the building. The Vance Tower. It would stand for 100 years, long after all of us were gone. It would stand because the foundation was strong. Today, I had made sure of it. A month later, I visited the site again. This time, I didn't take a taxi. I drove my own car and parked in a reserved spot marked Chief Architect. Before I even had the engine off, David was walking out of the site office, his own hardhat already on. The young security guard from my first visit was gone. In his place was a woman who smiled, checked my name on her list, and handed me my hardhat and vest without a word. "Dr. Reed," David said, his voice warm. "Good to see you. We're on schedule. The sublevel 3 deck cured perfectly. My team was very grateful for your junior architect, ... He was thorough." "Tom is one of my best," I said, pulling the hardhat on. "He's going to be a fine architect." "He learned from the best, I'm sure," David said. We walked toward the ramp. The sounds of construction were just as loud, but they felt different, more organized, less chaotic. "Leo is our new general site foreman," David said as we walked. "He's been running a tight ship. No revisions, no value engineering. Everything is exactly to spec, as it should be," I said. We descended to sublevel 3. The space was transformed. The area that had been a pit of mud and flawed steel was now a vast, smooth, pale gray floor. It was clean, solid, and perfect. The massive columns for the first floor were already in place, rising up from the new deck, reaching for the light. I saw Leo over by the new rebar grid for the next section. He was on one knee, his tape measure out, checking the spacing himself. He saw me and stood up, wiping his hands on his pants. I walked over, David a few steps behind me. I stopped at the edge of the new concrete and just looked at it. I could see the faint lines where the forms had been, 8 inches thick, solid as bedrock. I knelt slowly and placed my bare hand on the surface. The concrete was cool and slightly rough. It was strong. I could feel the integrity of it, the sheer dense power of the thing. "This would hold. It's good work, Leo," I said, without looking up. "We just followed the plans, Dr. Reed," he said. I could hear the pride in his voice. "Just like you said." I stood up, brushing the dust from my hand. I looked at David. "The project is back on track. You've done well, David. Both of you." "Thank you, Dr. Reed," David said. He meant it. I looked up, past the columns, past the next 2 levels of steel, to the small patch of blue sky visible at the top. The Vance Tower, it was rising. It would stand for 100 years. People would work in it, live in it, and never once think about the concrete and steel 3 floors beneath their feet. They wouldn't have to. They would be safe, because the foundation was strong. I turned and walked back toward the ramp, the sound of the work rising all around me.